February 8, 1945. Camp Livingston, Louisiana. The morning sun filtered through Spanish moss hanging from ancient cypress trees, casting dappled shadows across the compound's gravel pathways. Dr. Ernst Richter stood outside the camp hospital's pharmacy, a clipboard pressed against his chest, watching an American supply truck reverse toward the loading dock. The air smelled of pine sap and the lingering sweetness of magnolia blossoms, a scent utterly foreign to a man who had spent the previous 3 years in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. Inside the truck bed, visible through the open canvas flaps, were wooden crates stenciled with red crosses and English words he was still learning to decipher: plasma, morphine, sulfonamides, penicillin. That word alone carried weight that made his hands tighten on the clipboard. 3 months ago, before his capture near the Siegfried Line, he had watched a 19-year-old Wehrmacht corporal die screaming from a leg wound that had turned gangrenous. No antibiotics, no morphine, just leather to bite down on and prayers that death would come quickly. The boy had taken 4 days to die, his fever climbing until delirium overtook him, until he stopped recognizing the faces hovering over him in that converted barn that served as a field hospital. Richter had held the boy's hand at the end, feeling life slip away with each weakening pulse, powerless to do anything but witness. Now he stood in Louisiana sunshine, about to sign for medications worth more than a German field hospital had seen in the entire year of 1944. An American sergeant approached with a manifest, actually smiled, and handed over a pen. The exchange required Richter's signature acknowledging receipt of supplies that would be used exclusively to treat German prisoners, enemy soldiers, men who had fought against these same Americans who now provided them with cutting-edge antibiotics while their own wounded waited for treatment in field hospitals across France and Belgium. Richter signed the manifest with a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of the moment. Everything his military service had taught him about warfare, everything Nazi propaganda had proclaimed about American brutality and weakness, everything he had expected capture to mean, all of it was dissolving like morning fog under this relentless Louisiana sun. The sergeant nodded, handed him a copy of the manifest, and drove away. And Richter stood there, surrounded by crates of medicine that represented something far more dangerous than any weapon. Evidence that he had been lied to about nearly everything. This moment, replicated in hundreds of variations across American prisoner of war camps from 1943 through 1945, marked a profound rupture in the worldview of German medical officers. For doctors who had served in the Wehrmacht's medical corps, men trained in some of Europe's finest universities before being drafted into a regime that had systematically corrupted their profession, the experience of American captivity became an involuntary education in the stark difference between authoritarian expediency and democratic principle. What they encountered was not merely humane treatment as defined by the minimum standards of the Geneva Conventions, but something more unsettling. A systematic fairness that treated enemy prisoners with a level of medical care that often exceeded what German military doctors had been able to provide their own soldiers. To understand the magnitude of this cognitive dissonance, one must first grasp the medical catastrophe that German doctors had been navigating long before their capture. The Wehrmacht Medical Service had entered World War II as a sophisticated organization, benefiting from Germany's world-class medical education system and its tradition of military medical excellence stretching back to the Franco-Prussian War. German military doctors had access to well-equipped hospitals, modern surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical supplies that placed them among the best military medical services in the world. Medical officers like Ernst Richter had completed rigorous training at universities that had produced Nobel laureates and pioneered advances in surgery, bacteriology, and pharmacology. But by 1943, this system was collapsing under pressures it could not withstand. The Eastern Front's savage attrition consumed medical personnel faster than universities could train replacements. Supply lines stretched across occupied Europe, fractured under partisan attacks and Allied bombing. Pharmaceutical production facilities became rubble. The synthetic fuel program diverted chemical production capacity away from medicine. Hospitals in major cities burned in firestorms that consumed patients, staff, and equipment alike. What had been a world-class military medical system degraded into desperate improvisation, where doctors performed surgery by candlelight with instruments they could no longer properly sterilize, where morphine became so scarce that amputations were performed on fully conscious patients, where sulfa drugs were cut with inert powder to stretch supplies that could not be replaced. The ideological corruption was equally devastating. National Socialism had systematically poisoned German medicine from 1933 onward, purging Jewish physicians who had constituted nearly half of Germany's doctors in major cities, imposing racial pseudoscience on medical curricula, and conscripting the medical profession into programs of forced sterilization and euthanasia. The Nuremberg laws redefined medical ethics to prioritize the health of the folk over individual patients. Doctors took oaths pledging loyalty to Hitler rather than to healing. Medical research was directed towards serving military and ideological objectives rather than advancing human health. The profession that had produced Paul Ehrlich and Robert Koch became complicit in Action T4, in medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, in the bureaucratic machinery of genocide. Most Wehrmacht medical officers never directly participated in these atrocities, but they operated within institutional structures that had normalized such violations. They treated wounded SS soldiers without questioning what those soldiers had done. They certified racial classifications that determined who received treatment and who did not. They worked within a medical system that allocated resources according to military utility and racial hierarchy rather than clinical need. Even those who maintained personal integrity, who treated enemy wounded when regulations forbade it, who resisted the most egregious orders, still functioned as components of a fundamentally corrupted institution. Wehrmacht propaganda had carefully prepared medical personnel for the possibility of capture with predictions designed to discourage surrender. Americans, the propaganda claimed, would torture prisoners for intelligence, work them to death in labor camps, or execute them as war criminals. Medical personnel faced particular danger, the propaganda insisted, because Americans did not respect the Geneva Convention's special protections for medical staff. Stories circulated of captured German doctors being forced to perform medical experiments on fellow prisoners, of medical officers being hanged for their service to the Wehrmacht, of American soldiers desecrating hospitals and executing wounded. These narratives drew selectively on genuine atrocities. Soviet treatment of captured German medical personnel had indeed been brutal, while projecting that brutality onto all Allied forces. The actual moment of capture shattered these expectations almost immediately. Dr. Wilhelm Bauer, taken prisoner during the collapse of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, later recorded in his post-war memoir the shock of being treated by American combat medics who provided morphine for his shrapnel wounds, applied proper bandages, and evacuated him to an aid station where an American surgeon performed emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from his abdomen. The American medical personnel worked with efficient competence, following protocols that treated wounded prisoners identically to wounded American soldiers. The morphine alone, administered freely, without hesitation, to an enemy combatant, contradicted everything Wehrmacht propaganda had promised about American brutality. This initial medical treatment during capture reflected deeply embedded American military doctrine. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention governing treatment of prisoners of war, and American military medical training incorporated these international legal obligations as non-negotiable professional standards. The U.S. Army Medical Department's training manuals explicitly instructed medics and physicians that enemy wounded were to receive the same standard of care as friendly forces, that medical ethics transcended military loyalties, and that upholding these standards served both humanitarian and strategic objectives. American military culture, shaped by a conscript army drawn from civilian society rather than a professional warrior caste, brought civilian medical values to military practice. But beyond institutional policy, the treatment German doctors encountered reflected something deeper in American culture. The medics and physicians staffing field hospitals and prisoner collection points were civilians in uniform, teachers, farmers, factory workers temporarily serving their nation before returning to civilian life. They had been raised in a society that, despite profound racial injustices and social inequalities, nevertheless promoted ideals of fair play, equal treatment under law, and the dignity of individuals regardless of background. These values, however, imperfectly realized in American society, shaped how American soldiers approached their defeated enemies. Dr. Richter's journey from capture near Aachen to Camp Livingston illustrated the systematic nature of this treatment. After initial medical care at an aid station, he was evacuated through processing centers where American intelligence officers interviewed him, recorded his credentials, and identified him as a medical professional. This classification was not casual bureaucracy, but careful adherence to Geneva Convention provisions designating medical personnel as retained persons, with special protections and obligations. He was segregated from general prisoners, assigned to medical duties, and transported to camps where German medical personnel were needed to treat fellow prisoners. The transportation itself communicated messages about American logistical capacity. Richter traveled by truck, by train, and finally by ship across the Atlantic, a journey that took weeks but was conducted with regularity and organization that impressed him despite his circumstances. Prisoners received rations during transport, had access to sanitation facilities, and were guarded by military police who enforced regulations protecting prisoners from abuse. The sheer scale of the operation, thousands of prisoners moving through transcontinental logistics networks while the war continued on multiple fronts, demonstrated organizational sophistication that Richter recognized as evidence of industrial and institutional capacity far exceeding Germany's. Arrival at Camp Livingston in late 1944 marked the beginning of the most profound phase of Richter's education. The camp, located on 47,000 acres of Louisiana pine forest, housed over 8,000 German prisoners at its peak. It included barracks constructed specifically for prisoner accommodation, recreation facilities, educational buildings, chapels for religious worship, and a hospital complex that would become Richter's primary world for the next 18 months. The camp was one of more than 500 POW facilities scattered across the continental United States, housing over 400,000 German prisoners by war's end, a massive undertaking that required enormous resources and reflected strategic decisions about how to handle the waves of captured enemy soldiers. The hospital at Camp Livingston occupied several buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main structure included multiple wards segregating patients by condition: surgical cases, medical patients, infectious diseases, psychiatric cases, and a separate ward for terminal care. An operating theater with modern surgical lighting, sterilization equipment, and anesthesia apparatus occupied a dedicated space. Laboratory facilities allowed for diagnostic work. A pharmacy stocked medications in quantities that seemed almost obscene to doctors accustomed to desperate scarcity. Administrative offices maintained medical records for every prisoner patient. The entire complex operated with electrical power, climate control, running water, and all the basic infrastructure that German field hospitals had lacked for years. Richter's assignment to this hospital placed him under the supervision of Major Thomas Caldwell, a surgeon from Chicago who had practiced at Cook County Hospital before the war. Caldwell's approach to overseeing the German medical staff established patterns that would define Richter's experience of American fairness. Rather than treating German doctors as subordinates to be commanded, Caldwell organized the hospital as a professional medical facility where clinical competence determined authority regardless of nationality. He conducted regular staff meetings where German and American medical personnel discussed cases, reviewed treatment protocols, and addressed operational challenges. He solicited clinical opinions from German doctors, deferred to their expertise in areas where they had more experience, and acknowledged their professional credentials without condescension or suspicion. This professional respect was not naive trust. American medical officers monitored German medical staff carefully, maintained ultimate authority over all clinical decisions, and enforced security protocols. But within those boundaries, they treated German doctors as colleagues engaged in shared professional work. Caldwell lent Richter medical textbooks from his personal library, including recent American publications on trauma surgery and antibiotic therapy. He discussed advances in penicillin treatment, acknowledging German scientific contributions to sulfa drugs while explaining how American industrial capacity had solved the mass production challenges that had prevented German pharmaceutical companies from producing penicillin. He spoke about medicine as an international profession with universal standards, a conception that implicitly challenged the nationalist and racial ideologies that had corrupted German medicine. The medications that arrived in that February supply shipment became the physical embodiment of everything. Richter was learning about American society. The penicillin, manufactured in vast fermentation facilities by pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Squibb, represented industrial achievement that German scientists had understood theoretically, but German industry could not replicate. Alexander Fleming had discovered penicillin's antibacterial properties in 1928, but transforming that laboratory curiosity into a mass-produced pharmaceutical required enormous investments in fermentation technology, chemical engineering, and industrial production. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies were producing enough penicillin to supply Allied military medical needs and still have surplus for civilian use. German scientists and pharmaceutical companies had known about penicillin, had even conducted preliminary research, but Germany never achieved industrial-scale production. The reasons were complex: resource constraints, Allied bombing of industrial facilities, the Nazi regime's chaotic approach to scientific research coordination, the diversion of chemical production capacity to synthetic fuel and explosives. But the result was unambiguous. American soldiers and American prisoners had access to revolutionary antibiotics that could prevent infections and save lives, while German soldiers and German civilians died for lack of drugs that American industry produced in abundance. Richter used that penicillin to treat German prisoners with infections that would have been death sentences in Wehrmacht field hospitals. A former Panzer commander with a compound fracture that had become infected, the leg was saved through aggressive antibiotic therapy combined with surgical debridement. A Luftwaffe pilot with pneumonia developing into sepsis recovered fully after penicillin injections cleared the infection. A young conscript with a wound infection that had advanced to osteomyelitis survived because of antibiotic treatment that prevented the infection from spreading to his bloodstream. These successful treatments accumulated as evidence that challenged not just Richter's medical experience, but his entire understanding of the war he had served. Each vial of penicillin in the pharmacy represented a moral question that Richter could not avoid. If American industry could produce these medications in such abundance that even enemy prisoners received them, while German civilians died from treatable infections, what did that reveal about the relative industrial capacity of the two nations? If American military doctrine mandated providing cutting-edge antibiotics to captured enemies, while Wehrmacht medical services lacked basic supplies for their own soldiers, what did that reveal about the two systems' relative organizational competence and moral priorities? If American pharmaceutical companies had solved production challenges that German companies could not overcome, what did that reveal about the two societies' relative scientific and industrial sophistication? The propaganda narrative that Richter had absorbed, America as a decadent nation weakened by capitalism and racial mixing, Germany as the pinnacle of civilization defended by superior organization and will, could not survive exposure to these penicillin vials. Material reality was more persuasive than any ideology. The medicine existed, worked exactly as promised, and arrived in regular supply shipments managed by logistics networks that functioned with mechanical reliability. This was not propaganda or deception, but simple fact, repeated every time Richter opened the pharmacy cabinet and saw shelves stocked with medications that represented the practical application of industrial capacity, scientific knowledge, and institutional competence. The surgical theater provided another venue where American fairness manifested in ways that challenged Richter's expectations. When German prisoners required surgery, American medical officers allowed German surgeons to perform the procedures under supervision rather than insisting on doing it themselves. Richter performed his first surgery in American captivity in November 1944, an emergency appendectomy on a prisoner who had developed acute appendicitis. Major Caldwell observed from the gallery but did not interfere, allowing Richter to work according to his own surgical judgment and technique. The operating room had proper lighting, functioning equipment, adequate supplies, and, most remarkably, anesthesia that allowed the patient to sleep peacefully through the procedure rather than enduring conscious surgery. That anesthesia represented another dimension of American abundance. German military medicine had run desperately short of anesthetic agents by 1943, forcing surgeons to operate on conscious patients or to use inadequate local anesthetics that left patients feeling the knives cutting and the bone saws grinding. Richter had performed amputations on soldiers who screamed and thrashed while orderlies held them down, had removed shrapnel from abdominal wounds while patients bit down on leather straps, had witnessed the psychological trauma that conscious surgery inflicted on top of physical wounds. The availability of proper anesthesia, ether, chloroform, and later sodium pentothal allowed surgery to proceed humanely without adding psychological torture to necessary medical intervention. The patient recovered successfully from the appendectomy, healed without infection thanks to prophylactic antibiotics, and returned to his barracks within 2 weeks. Richter documented the case in medical records that would be preserved and could be audited by international Red Cross inspectors or American medical authorities. This documentation requirement, maintaining detailed medical records for every prisoner patient, represented American institutional culture's emphasis on accountability, transparency, and systematic record-keeping. German military medicine had become increasingly chaotic as the war progressed, with documentation often abandoned in favor of expedient treatment under battlefield conditions. American insistence on proper medical records, even in prison camps far from combat zones, communicated that institutions mattered, that individual cases deserved documentation, and that professional standards should be maintained regardless of circumstances. The psychiatric ward introduced Richter to an aspect of military medicine that Wehrmacht culture had largely rejected. American military psychiatry recognized psychological injury as a legitimate medical condition deserving treatment. The Camp Livingston Hospital included a psychiatric unit Staffed by American psychiatrists and psychologists who worked with German prisoners suffering from what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional volatility, severe depression, and psychological breaks triggered by combat trauma. These prisoners received psychiatric care including counseling, medication, and therapeutic interventions designed to stabilize their mental health and prevent deterioration into permanent dysfunction. Wehrmacht medical culture had viewed psychological breakdown as cowardice or moral weakness rather than medical injury. Soldiers who could not continue functioning under combat stress were often punished as malingerers, executed as examples, or at minimum discharged with dishonor. German military psychiatry existed, but operated under ideological constraints that prioritized military utility over patient welfare. The notion that psychological suffering deserved the same careful treatment as physical wounds, that mental illness was illness deserving medical intervention rather than character weakness deserving punishment, contradicted core assumptions of militaristic culture. Richter observed American psychiatric treatment with fascination and growing recognition that Wehrmacht medicine had failed its psychological casualties. He saw German prisoners gradually stabilizing under psychiatric care, watched therapy sessions where prisoners were encouraged to discuss traumatic experiences rather than suppress them, and noted that American psychiatrists treated German prisoners' psychological suffering as legitimate medical concern rather than weakness to be scorned. This psychiatric care communicated that American military culture valued psychological well-being, acknowledged that human beings had limits beyond which further trauma caused breakdown, and believed that acknowledging these limits was wisdom rather than failure. The fairness extended beyond medical treatment into daily conditions that shaped prisoner experience. German prisoners at Camp Livingston lived in barracks with electricity, heating, and sanitation. They received rations that, while not luxurious, provided adequate nutrition, approximately 2,800 calories daily, more than German civilians were receiving in bombed cities by 1945. They had access to recreation facilities including sports fields, a library with books in German, and canteens where they could purchase small luxuries using scrip earned through work details. They could send and receive mail through International Red Cross channels, maintaining contact with families despite imprisonment. Religious services were conducted by German chaplains who had been captured with combat units, held in camp chapels equipped with crosses and altars. These conditions reflected American adherence to Geneva Convention requirements and the strategic calculation that humane treatment of prisoners would encourage surrender and facilitate post-war reconstruction. But they also reflected something about American institutional culture, a bureaucratic commitment to systematic fairness, a belief that even enemies deserved baseline dignity, and an understanding that how a nation treats defeated enemies reveals something essential about its character and values. The American military did not treat prisoners well out of naive idealism, but because doing so served practical objectives while aligning with values that American society, however imperfectly, genuinely professed. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners could not have been more stark. German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front faced brutal conditions in Soviet camps where starvation, disease, forced labor, and execution were common. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by Soviet forces, roughly one-third died in captivity. German medical personnel captured by Soviets were often singled out for harsh treatment, accused of war crimes, and subjected to interrogations under conditions that frequently resulted in death or permanent disability. Soviet captivity was something Wehrmacht soldiers feared with justification, leading many to fight desperately to avoid capture by Red Army units while surrendering quickly to Western Allied forces when given the opportunity. This disparity in treatment created strategic incentives that shaped the war's final stages. German units on the Western Front increasingly sought opportunities to surrender to American or British forces rather than fighting to the last man. Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front attempted to move westward, hoping to be captured by Western allies rather than Soviets. American fair treatment of prisoners thus served military objectives by encouraging surrender, reducing casualties on both sides, and accelerating Germany's collapse. The fairness was not simply humanitarian gesture, but strategic calculation that recognized humane treatment could serve military ends more effectively than brutality. Dr. Richter participated in this strategic dynamic as he treated German prisoners who had deliberately sought capture by American forces. They told him stories of soldiers who had walked toward American lines with hands raised, who had surrendered entire units when commanders recognized the war was lost, who had hidden in cellars until American troops passed so they could give themselves up rather than retreating toward Soviet forces. These prisoners spoke with relief about their capture, with horror about what would have awaited them in Soviet camps, and with growing recognition that propaganda about American brutality had been lies designed to keep them fighting for a cause that was already lost. The transformation in Richter's thinking was not instantaneous or comfortable. He struggled with loyalty to Germany, with shame at his nation's defeat, with guilt about his comfortable captivity, while German civilians suffered under Allied bombing and occupation. He wrestled with his own complicity in serving Wehrmacht Medical Corps, with questions about whether he should have refused to serve, with the recognition that his professional work had supported a regime whose full evil he was only beginning to comprehend. The camp hospital became a space for difficult internal work, where the practical demands of treating patients coexisted with philosophical and moral questions that propaganda had previously suppressed. News of concentration camp liberations reached Camp Livingston in spring 1945. American authorities required prisoners to view documentary footage and photographs from Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and other liberated camps. The images, skeletal survivors, mountains of corpses, gas chambers and crematoria, medical experimentation facilities, devastated prisoners who had somehow managed to remain ignorant of or indifferent to what had been done in their nation's name. For medical personnel like Richter, the concentration camp evidence was especially shattering because it revealed medicine's systematic corruption into an instrument of genocide. German doctors had participated in selecting prisoners for extermination, had conducted lethal medical experiments, had administered killing injections, had supervised the machinery of industrial murder disguised as medical procedures. The euthanasia program that murdered disabled and mentally ill patients had been conceived and implemented by physicians. The racial screening that determined who lived and who died was conducted using medical criteria. The cremation of evidence, the falsification of death certificates, the entire bureaucratic apparatus of genocide had required medical complicity at every level. Richter had not participated directly in these crimes, had served in conventional military medical units rather than SS facilities or concentration camps, but he had to confront that his profession had been fundamentally corrupted, that medicine's claim to be a healing profession had been violated at its core, and that his own service, however individually ethical, had occurred within and supported an institution that enabled unprecedented evil. The penicillin in his pharmacy suddenly carried additional weight. It represented not just American industrial capacity, but a medical system that, whatever its flaws, had not been corrupted into an instrument of genocide. Major Caldwell handled this period with a combination of moral clarity and professional distance. He did not accuse individual German doctors of war crimes without evidence, did not hold all German medical personnel collectively guilty for concentration camp medicine, but he also did not excuse or minimize the systematic corruption of German medicine. He spoke about medical ethics as non-negotiable professional obligations, about the Hippocratic tradition that transcended national boundaries, and about the responsibility of physicians to resist political pressures that would corrupt their profession. He challenged German doctors to think about how they would rebuild German medicine in ways that prevented future corruption, how professional ethics could be institutionalized, and how medicine could serve human health rather than ideological objectives. These conversations, conducted in a mixture of English and German with medical terminology providing common vocabulary, planted seeds for post-war reconstruction. Richter began to see his captivity not as temporary imprisonment before returning to a restored Germany, but as education for a different future. He recognized that Germany would need to be fundamentally transformed, that Nazi ideology had to be completely rejected, and that German institutions, including medicine, required reconstruction on principles that prevented totalitarian corruption. The fair treatment he received from Americans provided a model for what just institutions could look like, how professional standards could be maintained within proper constraints, and how abundance could be achieved through industrial and institutional competence rather than conquest and exploitation. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For German prisoners in American camps, this news created complex emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, shame at total defeat, fear for families in occupied Germany, and uncertainty about the future. American authorities began planning for eventual repatriation, but indicated that prisoners would not return immediately. Germany needed to be denazified, its economy rebuilt, its political institutions reconstructed. Prisoners would be held until these processes advanced sufficiently to ensure they would not destabilize reconstruction efforts. Medical personnel faced particular scrutiny. American and Allied authorities investigated German doctors for war crimes, identifying those who had participated in medical experiments, euthanasia programs, or concentration camp medicine. These investigations created anxiety among all German medical prisoners, even those confident of their innocence, because the systematic nature of medicine's corruption meant that nearly every German doctor had some connection, however indirect, to the regime's crimes. Richter underwent multiple interrogations about his service, his knowledge of Nazi medical programs, his political affiliations, and his actions during the war. The investigations were thorough, uncomfortable, and ultimately cleared him for eventual repatriation. But even as American authorities investigated past crimes, they also identified German medical personnel who could contribute to post-war reconstruction. Doctors without significant Nazi Party involvement, without evidence of war crimes, and with demonstrated professional competence were classified as candidates for early repatriation and assignment to medical duties in occupied Germany. This vetting process communicated that individual actions mattered more than collective guilt, that professional competence was valuable regardless of past political affiliations, and that reconstruction would require Germans themselves to participate in building a different future. Richter's repatriation came in summer 1946 as part of a group of German medical personnel being sent to the American occupation zone to address public health crises. He traveled by ship to Bremerhaven, then by truck to assignment in Bavaria, where he would staff a hospital treating German civilians and displaced persons. The Germany he returned to was unrecognizable: cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, millions homeless and starving. The economy collapsed, and the country divided under occupation. But he brought more than medical skills back to this devastated landscape. He brought experience of functional institutions, of systematic fairness, of medicine practiced with adequate resources and ethical orientation, and of a society organized on principles radically different from those that had led Germany to catastrophe. The penicillin that had arrived at Camp Livingston on that February morning became, in retrospect, more than just an antibiotic. It symbolized the material abundance that American society could generate through industrial capacity and institutional competence, the fairness with which that abundance was distributed even to defeated enemies, and the practical demonstration that democratic societies could achieve both prosperity and power without requiring totalitarian control or military conquest. That medication, manufactured in American pharmaceutical plants transported across continents through American logistics networks administered by German doctors treating German prisoners under American supervision, it embodied the complex intersection of abundance, fairness, and strategic calculation that characterized American conduct of the war and shaped the post-war world. For German doctors who experienced this fair treatment, the transformation was irreversible. They had lived behind propaganda's curtain, had experienced daily life in an institutional system organized on different principles, and had practiced medicine in conditions that revealed what the profession could be when freed from ideological corruption and adequately resourced. They could not unknow what they had learned, could not return to believing Nazi ideology's claims about Western decadence and German superiority, and could not accept that pre-war Germany should be restored rather than fundamentally transformed. As Dr. Richter worked in post-war Bavaria, treating patients in a damaged hospital with inadequate supplies and overwhelmed by demand, he carried with him the memory of Camp Livingston's pharmacy with its shelves of penicillin, of Major Caldwell's professional respect, of surgical theaters with proper lighting and anesthesia, of psychiatric wards that treated mental suffering as deserving of care. These memories became benchmarks against which he measured Germany's medical reconstruction, goals to work toward, and evidence that different institutional arrangements were possible. The fair treatment he had received as a prisoner became the foundation for his post-war work-building medical institutions that served patients rather than ideology, that maintained professional ethics, and that aspired to the standards he had observed in American captivity. Decades later, as the Federal Republic of Germany emerged as a democratic state and transatlantic ally, as German medicine rebuilt its international reputation on ethical foundations, the experiences of prisoners like Dr. Richter contributed to a broader reconciliation between former enemies. The fair treatment that German POWs had received, the penicillin and morphine, the professional respect, the adherence to Geneva Conventions, the systematic attempt to provide dignity even to defeated enemies, became part of the foundation for trust between societies that had been locked in total war. That fairness demonstrated that American power included restraint, that victory did not require cruelty, and that former enemies could become partners in building a more just international order. The morning sun filtering through Louisiana cypress trees, the Spanish moss swaying in warm breezes, the scent of magnolias mixing with pine, these sensory memories stayed with Ernst Richter for the rest of his life. They became associated with the moment when his understanding of the world shifted, when propaganda's lies became visible, when he recognized that he had served evil and that redemption required acknowledging truth. That February morning, when he signed for medications that would save German prisoners' lives, provided by enemies who had every reason to let those prisoners suffer, marked the beginning of his transformation from Wehrmacht medical officer to post-war physician committed to different principles. The penicillin vials in Camp Livingston's pharmacy, with their typed labels and standardized dosages, represented a truth about power that authoritarianism could not comprehend, that abundance shared builds more durable strength than scarcity hoarded, that fairness even to enemies demonstrates confidence rather than weakness, that treating all human beings with baseline dignity is not idealistic naivety, but practical wisdom that serves long-term interests better than short-term brutality. These vials of antibiotic, manufactured in abundance and distributed fairly, carried within them the seeds of Germany's democratic reconstruction, of transatlantic alliance, and of a post-war order where former enemies could recognize shared values and build common institutions. In the end, the fair treatment that stunned German POW doctors revealed something essential about the difference between democratic and authoritarian societies, not primarily a difference in military capability or economic productivity, though those mattered, but a difference in the relationship between power and principle, between strength and humanity, between what a society does when it has the power to be cruel and chooses instead to be just. That difference, embodied in penicillin vials and surgical equipment, in professional respect and psychiatric care, in the systematic attempt to treat prisoners fairly even during total war, proved more transformative than any military victory alone could achieve. It changed not just the immediate circumstances of prisoners' lives, but their understanding of what societies could be, what institutions should aspire to, and what principles deserved loyalty even after the regimes they had served had been revealed as evil and defeated in war, whose outcome demonstrated that justice, however imperfectly realized, possessed power that tyranny could never match.